CASJE, the Consortium for Applied Studies in Jewish Education, is an active network of scholars, practitioners, funders, and evaluators working collaboratively to advance the culture and quality of research in Jewish education, thereby producing an evidence base that can be applied to the problems in this field in order to improve and advance practice. Through coordinated convenings, incubators, natural experiments, and well-calibrated approaches to research, CASJE works to address some of the most pressing issues facing Jewish education today. The CASJE initiative is supported by Avichai and the Jim Joseph Foundation, and we really thank these important institutions for all that they do, and of course for supporting our work to benefit Jewish education and the Jewish community. Today, we are focusing on a pretty major issue, that of Israel education, specifically on Israel education and Jewish peoplehood. CASJE has taken on an initiative to address 5 elements in relation to Israel education in 5 research briefs, including assessing outcomes, Hebrew language education, purposes of Israel education, the Israel educator, and today's topic, the connection of Israel education to Jewish peoplehood. Today we have a number of panelists who are going to introduce themselves in a moment, and we will go from there. So if we can start with Richard, that would be great.
I'm Richie Duran, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Jewish Federation Israel Office, Jewish Federation of Chicago Israel Office.
Welcome, Richard. And Richard is one of the 3 authors of this Israel brief. Michael.
I'm Michael Soberman from Toronto, Canada. I'm the National Director of Canada Israel Experience and Jewish Initiatives for the Next Generation with Jewish Federations of Canada.
Welcome, Michael. Thank you both for being here. I'm going to go down how it shows up on my screen if we could talk to Akiva.
Hi, everyone. I'm Akiva Weiss. I'm an Orthodox rabbi here at Rutgers University with the Jewish Learning Initiative on Campus program. I, along with my wife, are University Affiliate Chaplains, and we are the directors of the program here on campus.
Okay. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Good evening here in Jerusalem. I am the Director of Leadership Development at the Jewish Agency of Israel, as well as the Director of the Machon, the Institute for Youth Leaders from Abroad.
Welcome. Shana Penn.
Hi, Shana Penn. I direct the Toby Foundation for Jewish Life and Culture in San Francisco, which works in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Poland primarily. Some work in Israel, and I'm a visiting scholar at the Graduate Theological Union Center for Jewish Studies in Berkeley.
Thank you for being here. And Tali.
My name is Tali Zalkowitz. I live in Los Angeles. I teach Jewish education at Hebrew Union College here in the Los Angeles campus. And since it's related to peoplehood, I'll add that I grew up in Vancouver, Canada.
All right. Welcome. I hope everyone appreciates the variety of our panelists today and the rich experience and knowledge that they bring to the table. And please feel free throughout the conversation to post on our Facebook page, to tweet us at CASJE, CASJE2, hashtag Israelhood. We made our own hashtag for this. And to just send messages and really be a part of this conversation and help guide it. We're going to begin with giving the opportunity to 2 of our 3 authors. Barry Chazan could not be with us today, but I'd like to give the floor to Michael and Richie to briefly share what their thinking was when they developed their brief, what they were trying to achieve, and what may have made it challenging. I'm giving you about 5 minutes.
I'm going to begin. I'm speaking also on behalf of Barry, who's on an airplane at the moment. But Barry and Michael and I tried to figure out, well, I think the first thing we decided was that we didn't want to present a normative stance, a new theory of or a new definition of Jewish peoplehood. We just felt that there's a lot of jargon out there, and we wanted to find a way to find out how these 2 concepts talk to each other, how peoplehood and Israel education inform each other, enrich each other, how they interface, and from there we wanted to try and frame research questions. So that was our task. And the way we did it was in a number of areas. First of all, we looked, as I started to say, at the relevance of one to another. And then secondly, we tried to trace the roots of peoplehood from the very origins of Judaism, and right up through the Zionist movement in Europe, Ahad Ha'am, and through Mordechai Kaplan in North America, And because sometimes there's the rhetoric out there is that peoplehood is something very new. So it gets a lot of attention. It's very much out there in the public conversation, but we wanted to show that it's been there from the beginning. And the conversation got deeply enriched in 1948 with the founding of the State of Israel. So we tried to look at the roots of peoplehood, how it traced itself through the whole Jewish story, and how this whole conversation went up a level with the founding of the State of Israel. And that was really a game-changing development. Beyond that, we looked at the very rich peoplehood literature that's emerged in the last, I would say, 10 years or so. Uneven literature, but that's framed some very important questions that we tried to distill from the literature. And then finally, we tried to frame some research questions, particularly three. One, a vision of Jewish peoplehood and how that guides Israel education. Two, how Israel education and peoplehood are anchored in space and time through the continuity of Jewish history and around the Jewish world today. And three, very specifically, in the particular context of North American Jewish life today, because Israel education and peoplehood don't function in a vacuum. And there are some very important developments on the stage in North America today. And we wanted to specifically look at, for example, with millennials, with changing affiliation models and so on, what are the globalization, what are the implications for peoplehood and for Israel education, and how they play off of one another, help one another, and so on. Michael?
In terms of sort of addressing the challenges, which was part two of the question, and you know, challenges, we're using it in sort of a very positive sense of the word, because we went into this seeing it as an exciting challenge to sort of write something on a field that was relatively new. And that, I guess, was our first challenge, that we were sort of focusing on the intersection of two fields that, relatively speaking, to Jewish education could be considered new. The second challenge was that peoplehood had changed dramatically since 1948, and you know, in a relatively short period of time, it presented some interesting challenges for the work that we were doing, and writing it in the context of a world within Israel, you know, presented some of those challenges. The third, and probably I would argue greatest challenge, was we had actually had a list of 6 researchable questions that we could have asked, but we then pared it down to the 3 that Richie just spoke about because of the scope of the topic. You know, Hebrew language, the role of the educator, and evaluation were all researchable questions that would have fit nicely within this brief, but as you heard earlier, they were also subjects of briefs unto themselves. So we mentioned them, we focused on the 3 that Richie had mentioned. And finally, I think with the emergence of all of the new peoplehood literature in a new world of Israel education, we're really much writing this in what one could call sort of a new era of Jewish and Israel education with distinct challenges and opportunities. And you know, we felt at times, you know, in a very good way, like Chalutzim or pioneers, sort of, you know, foraying into a field that has changed, you know, so significantly over the last number of years, and saw the writing of this as a big challenge to begin with. And just wanted to mention, you know, that working on this project with the likes of Richie Duran and Barry Chazan, that in and of itself was a wonderful experience, and getting to exchange our ideas, we really enjoyed doing that.
Well, we enjoyed benefiting from all of your hard work and your brief, so thank you both. I'm now giving an opportunity to our other panelists to pose questions based on your roles, where you're coming from, to our authors of the brief.
I have a question.
Any first takers? Shana, go ahead.
I'll go first. I really appreciated the paper a lot, and I thought that you laid out a lot of the different definitions of peoplehood very well. What I'd like to know is, how do you define Israel education, and the new, and this, what you call a new era of Israel education, and what's the narrative that we're talking about here, if there is one, or narratives?
I would start sort of by answering the question in the following way. I mean, I think that if you take a look at what's been happening in the field, certainly the last 5 to 7 years, there have been a number of different organizations in Israel and in North America who have really focused on the new field of Israel education. Until then, one could argue that perhaps it wasn't a field unto itself, but rather sort of a subset or a subfield of Jewish education, and one that in many circles hadn't changed dramatically over the past several decades. So, you know, with the emergence of things like the iCenter and Macomb and other organizations focused at Israel education, it's really sort of, you know, I think stemming a lot from this notion that over the recent past, Israel advocacy has almost, and these are my own words, sort of hijacked the Israel education agenda. And many of our young people are learning about Israel education supposedly through CNN or Fox News or Facebook, really focusing on the conflict and on advocacy. And I guess the emergence of this field of Israel education was to take a much more systems and a holistic approach, that Israel education is not sort of a block of time that happens, you know, during a day at school or a day at summer camp, but rather it's a much more holistic approach that really incorporates so many different factors.
I really appreciate that clarification. Thank you. Any of our other panelists have a question?
I suppose I would like to know if you, you know, could do. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, and it's a tough question, but just to nurture the conversation here a bit further, what's the definition then of in response to that of peoplehood? Because peoplehood wasn't put in the title as peoplehood education; it was put in more as more of a vacuous term, peoplehood. And I'd be interested to hear what, if you put a slew of definitions out there for us. What are your favorites or favorite?
Were you able to hear the question, Richie, Michael?
I heard it very broken.
Maybe if you want to repeat what you think.
I heard
the question for the audience.
Go ahead.
I think because we just heard about how Israel education has been revamped and changed in recent years, and so the question is, Jewish peoplehood was you know, very different 10, 20 years ago, and obviously throughout the history, as you had explained. So how do we take that into account? Sarah, is that?
What's the definition? What would be your definition today of peoplehood?
Okay.
Of peoplehood.
Yes.
So I think that was the point that I tried to open with, is that we took an analytic approach rather than a normative approach. And we intentionally avoided trying to provide sort of a bottom line definition. We were more focused on trying to understand how other people were using it in the literature and in different contexts, and seeing what we could learn from that, because we really felt we were going to stifle the conversation if we gave a single definition. We didn't want to box either one of these into some kind of narrow, confining niche. So I don't think that was our task, and we didn't try to go there. I don't think it helps us to try and squeeze it into, you know, some kind of a monolithic definition.
Fair answer.
I don't know what else to say.
We
took a very different approach. We tried to be analytical rather than too. Okay.
No, that makes sense. Tali, did you have a question?
Sure, but I didn't know if Sarah wanted to follow up.
Well, maybe when she's unfrozen, she'll follow up. But for now, if you want to move forward.
She's thinking deeply. Okay, I'll jump in with something actually sort of much more specific. These were big questions. I'm wondering, towards the end of the document, you make a sort of tantalizing or really inviting invitation to use peoplehood as a lens or even a prism for bringing into resolution those areas of Jewish life across time and space that have been unifying. And I was wondering if perhaps paradoxically, given the idea of peoplehood, if peoplehood could also serve, do you think, productively to name divisive components of Jewish life, and if that would be productive or valuable? In other words, not only to address harmonies, but also conflict.
So it's a very interesting question, and I'm thinking as I listen to you that it may be a reflection of the three people who work together. It was our first time collaborating together, but I think that if in between the lines you can distill, I'm wondering if it's our disposition and our worldviews that happen to be in sync with one another. But I think that for all of us, peoplehood was a big tent kind of a metaphor. In other words, that one of the essential qualities of peoplehood is that for us was that it's very inclusive. So I don't really think that we encountered it as some kind of like a divisive factor. in the Jewish experience. But I'd be very curious to hear, what's behind the question, because maybe that would help us think more deeply.
Well, what's behind the question for me is wondering if, the peoplehood is a problematic idea, especially today in our postmodern, post-essentialist context in 21st century life, and grappling with it may not be nefarious or problematic. It may be actually the work of this era, and bringing those things into light through the lens of peoplehood. I was wondering, I was thinking, because I really appreciate the idea of using it as a lens to look at harmonizing and unifying elements, and wondering if it would be equally productive and worthwhile for us as leaders, scholars, to invite also the pressure points of Jewish life and to open up conversation through those avenues.
So I think that one of the things that we found in the literature, first of all, is that when you try and to understand Jewish life through the lens of peoplehood, you come up against some of the very same issues that we encounter in so many other contexts: questions of boundaries, questions of normative versus descriptive, questions of anchors of identity in a postmodern period. So peoplehood doesn't in any way kind of it's not like a shortcut to get around all the problems and all the challenges that we face in building a very vibrant Jewish life and sustaining Jewish continuity. It has to deal with those challenges as well. But we felt that at its essence, it's very inclusive. One of the ways that peoplehood and Israel education speak to one another, for example, is that when Jews from one place in the world encounter Jews in Israel, or for that matter, other places in the world, there's a built-in peoplehood component to that, right? In other words, you just by virtue of meeting, whether it's virtually over the internet or it's a mifgash on the Taglit trip or whatever the context is, a pen pal program and your partnership between an Israeli community and someplace out in the Jewish world, there's an experience of peoplehood. It could be so we just felt that it allows all different kinds of people in, all different kinds of Jewish identities, Jewish affiliations, Jewish worldviews, and so on. There's room in the tent for everybody. And we didn't really feel. I had actually agreed very much with what Sarah wrote in the curricular piece about the fact that it lends itself beautifully to the younger people. Sarah wrote that she didn't see a problem. That it wouldn't necessarily be so challenging for people from younger generations to connect to this. It could be a very inviting kind of bridge, and I think we agreed.
And I would just like to add, if I can, really from a practitioner standpoint, as someone who works predominantly in the area of Israel Experience, Birthright Israel, and other programs, bringing people to Israel for the first time that really don't have a strong connection, I would sort of almost argue that the more you know and the more ensconced in Jewish life you become, the more challenges you have with this notion of peoplehood. For those sort of coming in their first foray, it is a fabulous tool to connect with them, what's happening over there, the people and the places, and what's happening in their own communities. And it serves as a very nice bridge and a topic that is, easy for them to digest. And there's been very little pushback when they're introduced to this notion of Jewish peoplehood, extended beyond the boundaries of their own community and not, remaining only in Israel. So on the flip side, it's been very, it hasn't been very controversial or contentious in those demographics.
Interesting. Thank you.
I'd like to mention that Sarah wrote an educational initiative in response to the research brief, and all of those for all of our research briefs are forthcoming. So stay tuned. But for now, I want to give Akiva a chance because everyone else had a question. But if not, we can move on. So Akiva. And I can't hear you, Akiva. You have to unmute. Okay.
A chance to ask a question, right?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay.
I was actually just curious as to what role, if any, Birthright has played in really bringing this issue to the fore. Because now, I know that there's recently there's a bit of a controversy with the recent J Street convention, that a Hillel director, I think, spoke out about issues, I think, about birthright. And people talk about birthright a lot when it comes to Jewish identity. So I was just wondering how, whether or not birthright plays a key factor in this, or awakening Jewish students or Jewish youth to this notion of peoplehood or identity.
So, I mean, listen, in my experience, and I'll sort of preface it by saying my experience, my point of reference is mostly Canada. I've worked a bit in the States, but Canada sort of becomes the place where I've worked, and there are definite differences between the Canadian Jewish community and the American Jewish community. That perhaps could be the topic of a completely different panel. But I think that the whole notion of birthright and, criticisms aside, it has, I would argue, been the single most powerful tool the community has had to take people who may not be connected to the community in the most meaningful way, or in the same way perhaps as their parents or grandparents, and to introduce them to this whole notion of Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood and being a part of a community, and we do that through the Birthright Israel experience. And I think that, again, people coming at it with no preconceived notions, people sort of coming at it from, I really have been on the periphery of Jewish life and this is my first foray into it. I think one of the strongest arguments we have collectively to entice them to become more involved and to become part of their community when they come home is this whole notion of belonging and this whole notion of peoplehood and its connection to Israel and the education they receive there and upon the return.
All right, thank you. Shane, I actually wanted to call on you because I feel like you may have something to add. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I think I think Birthright is a wonderful opportunity for young adults who have no experience, not only of peoplehood, but very little experience of Israel, to go and to really get it in a kind of double whammy of what a sense of belonging is, what part of our identities are shaped by, and where we belong. The belonging is very important. The sense of entering a global community that's more tangible, of being a part of a conversation. And to me, so much of peoplehood revolves around entering a Jewish conversation that's been going on forever, and that deals with these tensions between individual and collective identities, tensions since in the last 70 years between what is Jewish, what is Israeli. These are very positive opportunities, and I see them being realized through Birthright. And I'm very excited to report that the Toby Foundation and our sister foundation, CRED, are working with Birthright right now to work on an extension to Poland, so that next summer students from the San Francisco Bay Area will go to Israel, and then for a few days to Poland. The Birthright directors are in Poland right now on our Heritage Tour. And what we found is, because, and I'll say this really quickly because I'm sure you want to go on to other people, but the Toby Foundation's entrance into Peoplehood was through working in Poland and working in the area of revitalization of Jewish life and culture in a post-Holocaust, post-communist setting. And there you had Jews of multiple generations who were so willing to belong, who get peoplehood because they were re-entering the the global Jewish community and rebuilding Jewish life. And so there are ways in which there's a Birthright Poland and a Birthright Israel, where lessons about legacy, a greater purpose in life, where we come from, which is also important for young adults, are beginning to have an even more complex conversation between North America, Poland, Eastern Europe, and Israel.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. We may or may not come back to this topic, but I would like to move forward with our next question, which is being posed to Sarah and Akiva. Are Jewish peoplehood and Israel education complementary values or commitments? Do the two not often compete and or conflict depending on the resources available? How do you balance and or complement these two goals and values? And whoever wants to jump on it first.
I'm just scared that I'm going to get cut off again, so
okay,
I'm
go for it.
excuse me if I'm repeating something because I came in and out. So as an educator, I'm actually interested in exploring the tensions between the two. I think they are potentially more generative. I think that there are one obvious tension, which is the normative assumptions driving the Israel education and peoplehood agenda. One is very centralized. Israel education points to a clear center of the Jewish people and makes some statement around what the legitimacy is about Jews living in other areas of the world. To me, the pedagogical implication of that is quite serious, because what you have is, as an educator, you have to negotiate a negative power relationship, where if you're an Israeli and you're a part of the conversation, you are therefore more privileged, as it were. And if you're out of the conversation, by definition, around the globe, based on the some of the normative assumptions around Israel education, then you have you're coming to it in some sense disenfranchised, and to me that negative power exchange can sometimes be kind of set up a disequilibrium in the engagement of ideas. That's my first piece.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Akiva,
were you able to hear me?
Yes.
Almost entirely. Speaking slowly for you is very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. Akiva.
I think that they are. I would like to believe that they're complementary. What I think that happens is often Israel education. Oftentimes, I think when people talk about Israel education, it's about the state of Israel. And not the place of Eretz Yisrael in the identity of the Jewish people. And I feel that that's sometimes what ends up happening is when people talk Israel education, immediately it becomes, you ask whether or not there's a conflict, I will say it becomes conflicted with politics. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's something that that people tend to focus on, as opposed to where the place of where has Eretz Yisrael as really the homeland of the Jewish people been for thousands of years. Where does that play a role? And I don't know how much Israel education focuses on that versus really focusing on mid to late 1800s onward with the birth of the state of Israel. So in that respect, I mean, I think that they really are complementary. But when it's taken, when I think you take an approach that Israel is really just modern day Israel that began in 1948 or a little bit before. That's when things begin. It seems that it's seen the political reality as opposed to a national, peoplehood ideological identity.
And are you arguing that these should remain separate in Israel education, or at some point they should be fused together?
No, I believe that they absolutely should be together. They should be seen as the same narrative, really. And I think it's a shame that it's only Israel nowadays for so many people. Is only seen in a modern context and not seen in a more historical context. I mean, Jewish people have been around for thousands of years. So 100 years in the lifespan of our nation is really something very small. Right. And Israel's played a much larger role. You're talking about hundreds, thousands of years.
Okay, thank you. Before I move on to the next question, I want to remind everyone that we're trying to integrate as many questions that we're receiving through Twitter and the Facebook page and our website, so keep on sending them in, #Israelhood. The next question is for Tali and Shayna. What, if any, research has informed your thought process or practice in regard to Israel education and or peoplehood? We'll start with Tali and then go to Shayna.
Sure. So as I was thinking about it, I think I was able to clarify two broad categories or genres of literature that I look to. One is comes from the Jewish world, and I try to keep up on the qualitative and quantitative research in the social sciences that are from, say, Steve Cohen and Ari Kelman, Lisa Grant, of course, Barry Chazan, looking at less academic but interesting ideas from Robbie Greengrass, for example, the ideas of wrestling and hugging, and in particular Shaul Kellner's ethnography Tours That Bind, which addressed birthright. And from those, I sort of get a sense of the empirical story of what's happening on the ground within the Jewish world. On the other hand, the other genre that I look to that I find very generative and provocative and challenging for me is research that has nothing to do with the Jewish world, at least consciously, and is about, say, negotiating biculturalism, which is a subfield of identity studies. They don't call it multiculturalism because that's, of course, something else, but when they say biculturalism, they mean at least managing two competing identities. And this field is about cultural frame switching. It's about opposing versus compatible cultural identities. And I think there's all sorts of really important things happening in the general secular fields of social sciences that have a lot to comment on and say about Jews who also happen to be humans. So I look at all sorts of sub-communities in the world who are struggling with similar challenges that we are. We're not the only ones who care about peoplehood. Just to list 3 or 4 very quickly to give you a concrete sense, there's Native Hawaiians, there's Native Americans on the mainland in the States and in Canada. Sikh youth in Britain have been studied, S-I-K-H, Sikh youth in Britain, in terms of self-determination and maintaining sense of group tradition and identity. And I'd say the last one I would add to that generic secular non-Jewish category of research is one of my sort of gurus in the field is Stuart Hall, who has written extensively about cultural identity and diaspora, specifically from an African-American point of view, but some of the things he's written you can substitute Jewish identity, and it's a great commentary on the work that we do.
Excellent. Shana, feel free to...
Okay, well, first of all, I apologize. I was actually expecting to respond to the question before based on the agenda that I received. But what I would
Surprise!
What I would say here is I also have been very influenced by the works that you cited, and but one of the things that is of interest to me is narratives, how narratives are made and how narratives are countered and reshaped and new narratives made. And I think that's very important to Israel education because the content of Israel education is important right now. We are no longer working off of the old Zionist myth narrative of making Aliyah and come and help build the Jewish state, which is which was definitely a very exciting prospect for my generation. But there are new narratives now that need to be developed, and I think that it's through Jewish peoplehood that I see Jewish peoplehood as being used strategically to help shape new narratives. And some of the people that I read include Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblatt, Destination Culture. I look at examples of how narratives are changing across Europe after the expansion of the EU and post-communist context.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This is a question for anyone who wants to answer. First come, first serve. In your field of work, how are you trying to cultivate or study Jewish peoplehood, and how is it a value in your work, or not? You have to be aggressive on this online hangout for that.
I'll take an initial stab at that question, which we're looking at in leadership development around the, and you'll see in the response to my paper, around, to the original paper, around what could a Jewish people leader be? What could somebody be who negotiates between the local and the global? That understands cultural diversity, that is able to engage empathy among other people, that understands the value of their local habitat, but also understands what the synergistic opportunities are if they apply their local awareness to the global world. In that sense, the literature, I suppose, that I'm very involved in at the moment is the local global theoretical world. And I think some of this work that we need to deal with as the Jewish Agency for Israel is the question of centralization, decentralization, and that clearly has implications to the way that we see shlichim, emissaries, the way that we relate to local communities. Some of that work on a strategic level has been done a lot by Macom in the way that they've built local capacity for Israel education endeavors. So I suppose that's the work at hand for us at the moment at the Jewish Agency.
Very interesting.
Can I add something? I think one of the peoplehood values that is influencing our work, and especially when we think about Israel education, is pluralism and diversity, and in breaking down the notion of there being of peoplehood being Israel-centered or Israel-centric. That peoplehood is now about locations of Jewish life worldwide, and that even from the perspective of young Israelis, that is a positive. That Israelis can be a part of a global community, and there's a real cosmopolitanism to young Israelis, and there's also a kind of Israeliness that is changing, shifting right now as Israelis engage with other cultures outside of Israel. So the pluralism is important also in breaking down the notion of there being two pillars of Jewish life in the world, one in Israel and one in the U.S., that there are more than two pillars these days.
Very interesting. Richie, go ahead.
So may I respond to Shane and then also add a point about professional...
Sure.
So I just want to add, take something that Akiva said, that I agree very much that it's a global, I think from my many years with the Jewish Community Center movement, how we used Israel experiences to engage people in Jewish peoplehood and North American JCCs, professionals, lay leaders, members of all ages and kinds. And at the same time, the World Confederation of JCCs that connects Jews all around the world in many different communities, exactly along the lines you're speaking of. But there's another level that I would not want to lose sight of, and I think you're there also from the things you talked about that the foundation's involved in, and that is going back to what Akiva said, that in addition to that, there's a very special foundation in Israel that just it provides windows and access to what we called in our paper Jewish lineage, the whole layers of history, the continuity of history, the Eretz Yisrael part that goes along with the State of Israel part, and the public Jewishness of space, the Jewishness of public space in Israel, we'll call it that, the very vibrant Jewish culture in Israel. And so I think there's this, in addition to this global Jewish connectedness that Israelis indeed are able to partake of today, there are very special opportunities in Israel to connect people to Jewish peoplehood, and that's actually part of the richness of Israel education, I think, that is very distinctive. So we have both. We're very fortunate to have both. In terms of, I just also wanted to add that the Federation movement has expanded the paradigms of Jewish peoplehood engagement. Once upon a time, as we know, it was very, very oriented towards more affluent and comfortable Jews around the Jewish world, helping more needy people in Israel. And that still exists. But in addition, there are wonderful new paradigms added to the menu along the lines of what Shana was saying. It goes two ways. It's people-to-people connections. There's philanthropy in Israel. There's even a new foundation that's sort of like a federation in Israel, in Ramat HaSharon. So there's wonderful new developments in the Federation movement to expand the way that many different ways the Jews around the Jewish world can connect to Israel and Israelis can connect back to them.
Okay.
Can I just add a point on that?
Yes.
I was just remembered something about what you said about the Federation. I remember my wife and I were looking. The Federation offered once a trip to Morocco to talk about what Jewish life was like in Morocco. And for us, we were debating who would get to go on that trip, myself or my wife. Neither of us ended up getting a chance to go. But just to talk about Jewish peoplehood is not just limited just to Eretz Yisrael and also to America, but throughout Jewish history where we've been. Hearing about a birthright Poland trip is sounds really remarkable. My initial reaction is what is the focus of a trip like that? Is that going to focus on, let's say, Holocaust? What the Holocaust did, or is it going to focus on what Jewish life was like in Poland? And are we going to have, for instance, could we see, I don't know, the advent of a trip, let's say a birthright Iraq, about what was the Babylonian experience of Jewish history like? There's so many places that Jews have been in Jewish history just to expose more and more and more Jews to this real historical narrative of the Jewish people, and I think that would really strengthen their sense of peoplehood.
Yeah, can I just address one thing there, Akiva, which is that what's great is everyone's going to, the birthright participants will go to Israel first. The beauty of the land and of meeting so many Jews, and to be a part of a very diverse Jewish state, but also a diverse multicultural country. A new, how a modern day Jewish society builds itself is the question there. In Poland, this is where most American Jews come from. 85% of North American Jewry comes from Poland, and so it's not. So what's great is there's the where do I come from in the greater sense of my ties to ancient Jewish history in Israel, and to what is there today, and the continuities and discontinuities in history. But also in Poland, there's a more intimate personal experience of where's my family come from, and I think that's, and then how do Poland and Israel relate today? Because there's a very strong synergy there. So that's something that makes it. I think it's a great place to go and debrief about Israel too, and one where also sees Poland is a breeding ground for Zionism. Here's where we know where all the urban Zionist, all the urban kibbutzim used to be, and the rural kibbutzim. So there's a lot to be learned from such an experience, cross-fertilization. That's Israel education too.
It's very interesting. As most of you are probably aware, March of the Living has the opposite approach in terms of timing. So I'm curious. We need to move on. So
right,
here we go.
That's a birth narrative.
Right. I have this question is being posed to Shana and Sarah, but if someone else had prepared an answer, please speak up. In what ways can Israel education promote or negatively affect Jewish peoplehood? And this time we'll start with Shana, and we'll go to Sarah.
I think only in saying that Israel is the center of all Jewish life, and I think that Israel reminds us of Yisrael Chai, that we are here, Jewish life we are alive. Jewish life is here today, and we are part of it. But it's not only Israel in terms of a birthright for us. So that's how I think it's that's the one problem I see.
Sarah,
I want to echo Shana's comment. I think what's profound about the peoplehood conversation is that it's civilizational in a very deep sense, that it is all-encompassing. I mean, Arthur Cohen, when he talks about redemption, talks about an aura concept. I think the peoplehood concept is like an aura concept, and it has the agility to keep up with the dynamic flow of Jewish life and its diversity. And I wouldn't want it to be what happens generally is you talk about peoplehood and you end up talking about Israel. It becomes reductionist. We kind of fall into that trap because of the pitfall of an aura concept is that it isn't really tangible. And we could lose something from that kind of redemptive quality of peoplehood when we focus only on Israel. I think one of the ways to do that is to move away from a concentric circle approach to Israel, where Israel's at the center, towards a nodal understanding of Jewish peoplehood, where Israel becomes a primary node, as it were, of intersecting pieces of Jewish history, culture, and people, but we kind of avoid the primacy or the centralization thrust of that, so to allow for the full diversity of the Jewish people to be heard and felt.
Excellent. I'd like to insert a question that's sort of related to this question about, I believe Shana brought up shlichim and the sort of the tool, not to say that people are just educational tools, but that shlichim are sent to around the world, to camps, to communities, to sort of help build knowledge and an affinity towards Israel and this land and state of Israel, but also to sort of, I think, encourage a peoplehood, a global peoplehood. And before sharing sort of things that I've learned on the ground, I'm curious to hear what you think about those sorts of programs, any sort of the pros and the cons, the challenges of bringing in shlichim. And anyone can answer. Michael, you're on the screen.
Sure,
so.
Sure. I think that it raises a really interesting point, and there's sort of the model of what the role of shlichim used to be, and they were coming very much as emissaries representing the state of Israel, with the hope of providing additional education to Jews living outside of Israel. And I think as we move into this realm of the relationship being more characterized by a partnership, this whole notion of mifgash and this whole notion of emissaries needs to at some point take on a much more multilateral approach. And the value, I would argue, of shlichim or shinshinim or Israelis who are serving outside of Israel in terms of what they're able to learn from being immersed in that environment and how it impacts their Jewish identity once they return to Israel, I think is incredibly valuable. And I think the best example of this is when Birthright Israel began, and it was determined that having a mifgash, an encounter with their Israeli peers, was essential. And the most logical group of their peers were all serving in the IDF. And in the initial years when the IDF was approached and asked if their soldiers could participate, Birthright was laughed out of the room. I mean, these are serious soldiers doing serious business, and they don't have time to spend 5 days touring around Israel with a bunch of spoiled North Americans. And after time, we've gotten to a place where more than 60,000 Israelis have participated in Birthright, but you have the top units in the army approaching Birthright proactively, saying, please take our soldiers, because what it does for them is of equal value to what it does for the North Americans. And I don't think anybody imagined this from the onset. And in fact, during a fundraiser we had once, a high-ranking officer in the IDF said to the crowd that we send our soldiers on Birthright, and they come back as better Jews, people who are more aware of this notion of peoplehood. So I think we really have to look at this street not as a one-way street, but as a two-way street or a multi-lane highway, where that exchange, is on a completely different plateau than it was, a decade or two ago.
Just to speak to the mutuality, I worked, I'm doing some work with the UJ Federation in Toronto, and the work we see with returning shlichim, shinshinim, young 18-year-olds pre-army shlichim, is that they come back with a greater understanding of Jewish peoplehood that we can lever for Israeli society. We're finding that fascinating in their leadership potential because they have what Tali described as a bicultural awareness. They're able to negotiate different notions of reality and belonging, and that's very powerful for Israelis who really live in a kind of isolated national sense of self within kind of very constrained boundaries of Israel.
There may also be another kind of shlichim developing today. I heard Sharansky speak in Palo Alto last year, and the Palo Alto JCC has a very strong Israeli membership, and they have an Israeli cultural committee. And Sharansky was saying that he really wanted to empower Israelis living in the diaspora to be spokespersons for Israel, and I mean not in terms of advocacy, but really in explaining the experience, the Israeli experience, and also the experience of immigrating and adopting to life in the U.S. And that one shouldn't hide or be ashamed of the fact that one left Israel, but that one should really bring Israel into their local American communities.
It's interesting, in spite of the advertising campaign that took place a number of years ago to try to encourage Israelis to make Aliyah again, I guess we'll call it.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, this is a question that was posted on our homepage on our website, which everyone could keep doing in case you forgot. Chat, tweet, Facebook, email. Here's the question. Can you speak to the relationship or tension between educating for peoplehood consciousness within a world made up of increasingly of multiple identities? How do we educate in a non-essentialist way? This was somewhat raised before, but if anyone would like to tackle it. Tali, you look like you would like to tackle it.
Richard had his hand up too, so either way.
Okay. Tali, then Richard. How about that? Is that
okay? I'll jump in. I'll try to be really brief.
Perfect.
First of all, I think one of the first questions is to ask what is the initial valence or attitude towards the notion of multiple identities? Because before you get to the non-essentialist question, I think the conclusion or the assessment that one has about the idea that multiple identities exists is going to determine sort of the direction of the conversation and the whole, to use Shayna's language, the kind of narrative that's going to ensue. From my experience, there are some people who say, yep, we got multiple identities galore, and it's a problem. This is destructive. This is going to, compromise possibilities for Jewish continuity, blah, 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 blah. And then there are those who say, look, multiple identities is neither good nor bad. It is. And not only is it not new, it's been around for ages. It's definitely not just a postmodern. We can look back to the Golden Age of Spain and many other historical periods where Jews have managed multiple and competing claims. I think what's new in this era, in this moment that we're having this conversation, is the whole idea that there isn't a totem pole of prestige or status. In other words, the non-essentialist impulse comes from the direction of saying, hey, none of these identities is necessarily better or worse than the other. We want to kind of have people navigate them all and come in and out. And I've heard people use the metaphor of permeable boundaries. How I educate in a non-essentialist way, or at least try to put it on the radar screen for my grad students, is I say there are two equal pillars of your professional work. I teach rabbinic students and education students. And I said, on the one hand, you're going to have to be cultural authorities and set boundaries, because as transmitters of Jewish life, that's an important role. At the same time, you're going to have to become experts in cultural fluidity navigation. And what's interesting is when I teach executive masters, people who have been in the field 5 years or more and are a little bit older, they get the cultural authority piece, and they feel like they've navigated that and have a sense of wisdom about that. And the fluidity piece is a little bit foreign and uncomfortable to them. Whereas my grad students, who are coming straight out of undergraduate programs and things, they love the flexibility, they're all over it, they understand the moving in and out of places, and the authority is really uncomfortable. Stepping into those shoes of saying, hey, I set boundaries and I'm a gatekeeper is not comfortable. So that's
very interesting. Richard, if you also maybe want to address the trend with the older generation and the upcoming generation.
First of all, I think that it's not an entirely new phenomenon in Jewish life. I mean, even in the earlier modern period, radical universalism was an ideology that competed against Buddhism and Zionism and diaspora nationalism and so on. So we've been in a different sort of incarnation. We've been in this situation before. It's a little looser now. I don't have a whole lot to add to what Tali said. The only point I agree with everything you said. The only thing I would add is that I think it's a competitive marketplace. I think we have to be we shouldn't be bashful about asking tough questions and trying to help people. We shouldn't make it easy. So if there are shortcuts that people are taking, allowing themselves, I think it's okay for us as educators and as community leaders to ask some of the tough questions and show some of the contrasts that are embedded in choices people make. But most of all, I think we have to be excellent and compelling. And if we run wonderful programs in the community, and the rabbis do wonderful work, and the Israel educators do great work, and the camp directors do great work, and Hillel and so on, if we're great and we do wonderful things and we'll help people find the Judaism, Jewish life, and connecting to Jewish peoplehood can be very meaningful and beautiful and deep, I think that's our work, and then people will make their own choices. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game of being Jewish and nothing else. We all have multiple identities. We just need to be excellent.
All right, I'm going to pose this possibly final question to Akiva and Tali, and I'm going to ask you to be really brief if possible. In terms of immersive Israel educational experiences, what sort of impact is intentionally or just naturally occurring in regard to peoplehood?
You want to say that again?
In terms of immersive Israel educational experiences, such as Birthright, what sort of impact is intentionally or naturally occurring in regard to peoplehood? I'm asking, what maybe as someone who's led a Birthright trip or is aware of the Birthright trip, and Michael, you can also speak to this. That would be great. What is and isn't intentional? What's going on in regard to peoplehood?
So I can answer briefly at first. I think what I'm discovering is there's a natural inclination for students who return from such trips or immersive experiences to want to learn more. Mm-hmm. They want to learn more about their Jewish identity. They want to learn more about Jewish history, perhaps, and specifically, many of them are turning to learn. They want to learn Torah, and that's an interesting phenomenon. I just see it naturally happening that they return and they want to know more. They want to go study more. Mm-hmm. Specifically Jewish topics and Jewish sources. That's what I'm seeing.
Great.
So the number one thing that's jumped out at me when I think about this question is, first of all, maybe we should think about America versus the rest of the world's Jews in terms of impact, because I think that the American template for identity and belonging is different than, for sure, the Commonwealth and European Jews. And I'll give you an example. Shaul Kellner's book, Tours That Bind, had as one of his sort of controversial or paradoxical theses that the birthright actually strengthens American Jewish identity. That is, when you take American Jews, to Israel, they come back as more connected to American Judaism and American Jewish life. And so it isn't about building necessarily a global Jewish peoplehood or an attachment to Israel per se. So if that's the peoplehood goal, then that's successful. We're building American Jewish connections. Mm-hmm. But the question that I'm left with is, well, what happens to these larger Klal Yisrael type roles, even in long-term trips that are longer than 6 months or a year? We know that the beginnings of research is coming back to say it's not. There's no consensus. It's not that the more. In other words, more time you spend in Israel, the more attachment you have. So it's not clear if and how those connections are happening.
Michael, can I give you 30 seconds if you want it?
Absolutely. Speaking on behalf of the entire Commonwealth, it's amazing. Americans refer to us as the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth refers to us as the 51st state. So talk about an identity crisis. We need our own peoplehood. But I would just say this. I would say that there is facets of the program that are both intentional and unintentional. I mean, Birthright has a very clear set of educational principles and a set of themes that they want to expose everybody to. But because the first of those educational principles is that the program is very much learner-centered, how the learner sort of, takes in what they see and what it translates to when they get back differs wildly. So, at the end of the day, if there was one goal that we were, focusing on, it's for them to understand the value of community and for them to want to be a part of a community in some small way more than before that they left. And that could manifest itself in any one of a number of ways. So that peoplehood agenda is very prominent because it is so broad and often so open to people saying, yes, I want to be a part of this people. As I said earlier, I think it resonates very strongly and has become, one of the key tools that we have to get them into that next track, whether it's learning Torah or learning about Israel or arts and culture or Hebrew language, et cetera, and so forth.
Great, thank you so much. We're closing up here. I want to thank all of our panelists for really taking the time out of their diverse yet probably equally busy schedules to be here today. This online panel, while we had many people participating live, we thank you for watching, and we also want you to know that it will be available for years to come on the CASJE website, CASJE.com. I'm going to ask our panelists to share one last sentence, an actual sentence, and just to thank them again: Michael Soberman, Richard Duran, Sarah Marley, Shana Penn, Tali Zalkowitz, and Akiva Weiss. Thank you so much for being here. And if we just want to go down in the line and share final thoughts, final words in a sentence. Michael.
this has been really fun, and I think it's the beginning of an ongoing conversation, one that I would like very much to have face-to-face with each and every one of you, perhaps even at the same time.
Akiva.
I second Michael's comments. I agree. Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity to participate in such a panel and a great discussion, and a very important discussion, I think, especially what's going on, what I see anyways, on campuses and in the minds of young adults, nowadays, young Jews.
Great. Richard.
I just feel very enriched, so I want to thank everybody. Very, very bright and insightful bunch, and I feel that we've just begun.
Sarah.
I'll just throw out a notion that we're working on, which is the notion of glocal, which is the mixture between globalization and global and local belonging. And I'm interested in exploring that further, and that's what we're going to be looking at in the future. So you're all invited to be a part of that.
Thank you. Shana.
Local sounds better than global. I'm in. One last comment, and it's related to what Akiva and Michael's last remarks, that what works along with tourism, technology, and encounters, I don't want us to forget literature and film and storytelling and knowing the stories of the movers and shakers at different times in our history, because all of that is so important to awakening a sense of purpose and a sense of belonging, and that's the internal experience. Tourism, technology, and encounters are very external and experiential, but that's the internal, and we can't forget it.
And Tali.
I would add to the word fun, inspiring. I was very stimulated by the conversation and hope to meet all of you face-to-face one day, and I leave this conversation lingering with a lingering question about the role of peoplehood as glue that could hold Jews together and become this access point and sort of democratic gateway for talking about a lot of things that are sometimes quite divisive. So thank you all.
Nice.
Well, thank you. I'm leaving today wanting more, and that's always a good sign, and I'm sure many other people feel that way. Please use our website and our Facebook and our Twitter to engage in these conversations in the future. And again, a thank you to the Avichai Foundation and the Jim Joseph Foundation for all that they do to support these really important conversations and interactions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Great to meet you.
Take care. Good day, good night, Laila Tov.
Right.
CASJE, the Consortium for Applied Studies in Jewish Education, is an active network of scholars, practitioners, funders, and evaluators working collaboratively to advance the culture and quality of research in Jewish education, thereby producing an evidence base that can be applied to the problems in this field in order to improve and advance practice. Through coordinated convenings, incubators, natural experiments, and well-calibrated approaches to research, CASJE works to address some of the most pressing issues facing Jewish education today. The CASJE initiative is supported by Avichai and the Jim Joseph Foundation, and we really thank these important institutions for all that they do, and of course for supporting our work to benefit Jewish education and the Jewish community. Today, we are focusing on a pretty major issue, that of Israel education, specifically on Israel education and Jewish peoplehood. CASJE has taken on an initiative to address 5 elements in relation to Israel education in 5 research briefs, including assessing outcomes, Hebrew language education, purposes of Israel education, the Israel educator, and today's topic, the connection of Israel education to Jewish peoplehood. Today we have a number of panelists who are going to introduce themselves in a moment, and we will...
Michael and I tried to figure out, well, I think the first thing we decided was that we didn't want to present a normative stance, a new theory of or a new definition of Jewish peoplehood. We just felt that there's a lot of jargon out there, and we wanted to find a way to find out how these two concepts talk to each other, how peoplehood and Israel education inform each other, enrich each other, how they interface, and from there we wanted to try and frame research questions. So that was our task. And the way we did it was in a number of areas. First of all, we looked, as I started to say, at the relevance of one to another. And then secondly, we tried to trace the roots of peoplehood from the very origins of Judaism. and right up through the Zionist movement in Europe, Ahad Ha'am, and through Mordechai Kaplan in North America. And because sometimes there's the rhetoric out there is that peoplehood is something very new. So it gets a lot of attention. It's very much out there in the public conversation, but we wanted to show that it's been there from the beginning. And the conversation got deeply enriched in 1948 with the founding of the State of Israel. So we tried to look at the roots of peoplehood, how it traced itself through the whole Jewish story, and how this whole conversation went up a level with the founding of the State of Israel. And that was really a game-changing development. Beyond that, we looked at the very rich peoplehood literature that's emerged in the last, I would say, 10 years or so. Uneven literature, but that's framed some very important questions that we tried to distill from the literature. And then finally, we tried to frame some research questions, particularly three. One, a vision of Jewish peoplehood and how that guides Israel education. Two, how Israel education and peoplehood are anchored in space and time through the continuity of Jewish history and around the Jewish world today. And three, very specifically, in the particular context of North American Jewish life today, because Israel education and peoplehood don't function in a vacuum. And there are some very important developments on the stage in North America today. And we wanted to specifically look at, for example, with millennials, with changing affiliation models and so on, what are the globalization, what are the implications for peoplehood and for Israel education, and how they play off of one another, help one another, and so on. Michael?
In terms of sort of addressing the challenges, which was part two of the question, and you know, challenges, we're using it in sort of a very positive sense of the word, because we went into this seeing
primarily some work in Israel, and I'm a visiting scholar at the Graduate Theological Union Center for Jewish Studies in Berkeley.
Thank you for being here. And Tali.
My name is Tali Zalkowitz. I live in Los Angeles. I teach Jewish education at Hebrew Union College here in the Los Angeles campus. And since it's related to peoplehood, I'll add that I grew up in Vancouver, Canada.
All right. Welcome. I hope everyone appreciates the variety of our panelists today and the rich experience and knowledge that they bring to the table. And please feel free throughout the conversation to post on our Facebook page, to tweet us at CASJE, CASJE2, hashtag Israelhood. We made our own hashtag for this. And to just send messages and really be a part of this conversation and help guide it. We're going to begin with giving the opportunity to two of our three authors. Barry Chazan could not be with us today, but I'd like to give the floor to Michael and Richie to briefly share what their thinking was when they developed their brief, what they were trying to achieve, and what may have made it challenging. I'm giving you about 5 minutes.
I'm going to begin. I'm speaking also on behalf of Barry, who's on an airplane at the moment. But Barry and Mike...
We'll go from there. So if we can start with Richard, that would be great.
I'm Richie Duran, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Jewish Federation Israel Office, Jewish Federation of Chicago, Israel Office.
Welcome, Richard. And Richard is one of the three authors of this Israel brief. Michael.
I'm Michael Soberman from Toronto, Canada. I'm the National Director of Canada-Israel Experience and Jewish Initiatives for the Next Generation with Jewish Federations of Canada.
Welcome, Michael. Thank you both for being here. I'm going to go down how it shows up on my screen, if we can talk to Akiva.
Hi, everyone. I'm Akiva Weiss. I'm an Orthodox rabbi here at Rutgers University with the Jewish Learning Initiative on Campus program. I, along with my wife, are university affiliate chaplains, and we are the directors of the program here on campus.
Okay. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Good evening here in Jerusalem. I am the director of Leadership Development at the Jewish Agency of Israel, as well as the director of the Machon, the Institute for Youth Leaders from Abroad.
Welcome. Shana Penn.
Hi, Shana Penn. I direct the Toby Foundation for Jewish Life and Culture in San Francisco, which works in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Poland.